Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read from Exodus 7 and 8 and talk about proof that God exists. In the world we live in, there's a lot of doubt about the existence of God. Some people simply claim He doesn't exist. Other people are open to be persuaded one way or the other. And there are people who claim to believe in God and they go to church and they're Christians, and yet they have doubts about the existence of God. There are several ways to argue for God's existence. One of those is to point out that God actually made an appearance on earth and intervened in human affairs. He performed miracles in front of eyewitnesses, and by doing that, He proved His existence. Exodus 7 and 8 contain some examples of that, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. We're going to look at proof that God exists. Now, before we get into Exodus 7 and 8, let's review the first few chapters of Exodus to set some context. Exodus 1 tells us the Israelites went to Egypt. There was about 70 of them. They were in Egypt for several hundred years. And while there, they became numerous, and eventually the Egyptians turned the Israelites into slaves. Exodus 2 tells us about the first 80 years of the life of Moses. Moses was born in Egypt. When he was an adult, he killed an Egyptian, so he had to leave Egypt and go to the land of Midian. And he was in Midian for several decades. Exodus 3 and 4 tell us that one day Moses was out in the wilderness of Midian tending a flock, and God appeared to Moses and told him to leave Midian and go back to Egypt, talk to Pharaoh, and lead the Israelites out of slavery. Exodus 5 tells us that Moses did indeed leave Midian. He went back to Egypt and he spoke to Pharaoh. However, things got worse. Pharaoh increased the amount of labor that the Israelites had to do, and so the Israelites turned against Moses. And then Exodus 6 tells us that God reminded Moses that God is the Almighty, God is all-powerful, and He can do the impossible. And that's the context in which we start reading in Exodus chapter 7. Now, Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "When Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, 'Work a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" Now, first of all, notice throughout today's passage, there's going to be quotes within quotes. And it gets a little hard to follow sometimes, and that's why I've indented some of these lines different distances to try and separate out these quotes. For example, this is a quote of what God said to Moses and Aaron, but then here, when God was talking to Moses and Aaron, He gave them a quote, this, of what they were supposed to say to Pharaoh. So it's a quote within a quote, and then this is a quote within a quote. And you'll see that throughout the passage. And again, that's why I've indented it to make it a little easier to follow all these quotes within quotes. Now, we see here God was being proactive. God told Moses and Aaron to go talk to Pharaoh. And it was quite natural that Pharaoh, put yourself in Pharaoh's position. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Hey, God says let the Israelites go." It was quite normal that Pharaoh would say, "Well, who is God and why should I listen to Him?" And so God was being proactive, and He gave Moses and Aaron some miracles that they could perform in order to, first of all, prove that God exists, and then prove that God was speaking through Moses and Aaron. And so the first miracle was to take a staff and throw it down, that it would become a serpent. Verse 10. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh, and thus they did, just as Yahweh had commanded. And Aaron threw his staff down before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same with their secret arts. For each magician threw down his staff, and they turned it into serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. First of all, we have the term wise men. The Hebrew word that's used there means wise man, or it's also used to refer to people who have skill, like someone who's a skilled weaver or a skilled sewer or a skilled craftsman of some sort. Then you have the word sorcerers. The Hebrew word there appears to refer to people that practiced black magic and did things through evil spirits. And then you have the word magicians. The Hebrew word there actually comes from a word that is used to communicate engraving and writing. And then you have the word secret arts, which simply means it was done in secret, or it was a trade secret. Now, when I was a kid, and I've read this, I used to believe that what was happening here was the magicians of Egypt were using some sort of black magic, or they were using demons, or they were using evil spirits to actually take a staff and turn it into a serpent. And I guess it's possible that that's what was happening, but I also think there's another possibility of what was happening. I think it's possible that the magicians of Egypt are actually doing what I would call a family-friendly magic show. And here's what I mean by that. When my kids were in elementary school, one day the school had a program for parents and students, and they brought in a magician who did a magic show for us. And this was clean, family-friendly magic. He did some card tricks, and one of the tricks he had was he had two rings that appeared to be solid, and he would do various stuff with the rings to demonstrate that they were solid rings. And then after a while he did something, and suddenly the rings were interlocked with each other. And then he would do things to show that they were solidly linked and you couldn't get them apart. But then after a while he would manage to get them apart. And obviously there was some sort of a mechanism within these rings that allowed for an opening in the ring at some point so they could slide them together and then later slide them open again. Also, the magician did some card tricks. And it's a trick where a student pulls out a card, shows it to the audience but not the magician. Student puts the card back in the deck, and then the magician does a bunch of things with the deck, makes it appear like he's shuffled the deck really well, and then after a while the magician pulls out the card and shows the card that the student had chosen. So that's what I mean by family-friendly magic tricks. They're very clean, and obviously there's some sort of a trick, some sort of a secret to this, that the magician makes it appear that he's making two solid rings magically go together and open up, whereas the reality is there's some sort of a mechanism there, and he's very skilled, he practices his craft, and he's able to open the mechanism, join the rings, and then close the mechanism without the audience ever seeing what he's doing. Same thing with the card trick. The magician practices his craft, he's able to have the student put the card back in the deck, and he can do all sorts of things with the deck, but the reality is he never loses track of where that card is. And so at the end of his trick, he's able to make that card appear, and it appears like he magically read somebody's mind to figure out what card it was, but the reality is, because of his skill, he always knew where that card was, and he makes it appear at the end, and he makes it appear like it was magic when really he always knew where that card was. So I think it's possible that what was happening here is that these Egyptian magicians were doing a family-friendly magic trick. In other words, they figured out a way to make it appear like they were taking a staff and turning it into a serpent. So let's continue reading verse 13. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as Yahweh had said. Then Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, he refuses to let the people go. So again, we see that. So we see here that the first trick did not work, and part of the reason it didn't work is because the magicians were able to replicate what Moses and Aaron did, and it allowed Pharaoh to pretend that Moses and Aaron really weren't, it allowed Pharaoh to pretend that God was not working through Moses and Aaron. Instead, it enabled Pharaoh to pretend that Moses and Aaron were simply performing some sort of magic trick, just like his magicians had. All right, verse 15. And this is God talking to Moses. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet Pharaoh on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. You shall say to Pharaoh, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, Let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness, but behold, you have not listened until now. Thus says Yahweh, By this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, I will strike the water that is in the Nile with a staff that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile. Then Yahweh said to Moses, Say to Aaron, Take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their streams, and over their pools, and over all the reservoirs of water, that they may become blood, and there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. So Moses and Aaron did even as Yahweh had commanded. And he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had said. Then Pharaoh turned and went into his house with no concern even for this. So all the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the Nile. 7 days passed after Yahweh had struck the Nile. So we see that the second miracle did not persuade Pharaoh either. And again, the reason was the magicians of Egypt were able to make it appear that they had turned water into blood, and that allowed Pharaoh to believe that Moses and Aaron were simply performing some sort of magic trick that allowed them to appear to turn water into blood. And then we start reading chapter 8. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says Yahweh, let my people go that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let the Israelites go, behold, I will smite your whole territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs, which will come up and go into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the houses of your servants and on your people and into your ovens and into your kneading bowls. So the frogs will come up on you and your people and all your servants.'" Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the streams, and over the pools, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt." So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. The magicians did the same with their secret arts, making frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Entreat Yahweh that he remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the Israelites go that they may sacrifice to Yahweh." Now, something interesting here. Pharaoh called Moses and asked them to get rid of the frogs. Why didn't Pharaoh asked his magicians to get rid of the frogs? If his magicians could truly create frogs, then surely they could get rid of the frogs also. Verse 9, Moses said to Pharaoh, "The honor is yours to tell me, when shall I entreat for you and your servants and your people that the frogs be destroyed from you and your houses, that they may be left only in the Nile?" Now, notice Moses allowed Pharaoh to choose the time. Now that's significant. If indeed the magicians of Egypt were simply doing family-friendly magic tricks, and if indeed Pharaoh believed that Moses and Aaron were simply doing family-friendly magic tricks, it's significant that Moses allowed Pharaoh to choose the timing, because part of what enables magicians to perform their craft and do their show and make it look like they're doing what they pretend to be doing is that they're in control of everything. They control all the objects they work with. They also control the timing. And with magicians, timing is very crucial. And they practice that to get the timing just right on what they do. And so when Moses allowed Pharaoh to choose the time, Moses was giving up control over the time, and that was another way for Moses to try and demonstrate to Pharaoh that Moses and Aaron were not doing some sleight of hand or some magic trick. Instead, it was actually God who was doing this. All right, verse 10. Then Pharaoh said, "Tomorrow." So Moses said, "May it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like Yahweh our God." And here we see the point of all this. All this was happening so that Pharaoh would know that there is no one like Yahweh. And all these miracles were being performed to prove that Yahweh exists and to prove that Yahweh is all-powerful. Verse 11, and this is Moses speaking to Pharaoh. "The frogs will depart from you and your houses and your servants and your people. They will be left only in the Nile." Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to Yahweh concerning the frogs which Yahweh had inflicted upon Pharaoh. Yahweh did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, the courts, and the fields. So the Egyptians piled the frogs in heaps, and the land became foul. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to Moses and Aaron, as Yahweh had said. And so we see that the third miracle did not persuade Pharaoh, And again, part of the reason was the magicians were able to make it appear that they could bring forth frogs. And so Pharaoh was able to pretend that Moses and Aaron were simply playing tricks or practicing some sort of sleight of hand. Verse 16, Then Yahweh said to Moses, Say to Aaron, Stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, that it may become gnats through all the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron did so, and Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats through all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Now, notice the magicians could not do this. Now, why was this? Well, let's assume that the magicians were doing family-friendly magic tricks. The magicians came up with some way to make it appear like they were turning a staff into a serpent. The magicians came up with a way to make it appear that they could turn water into blood. And the magicians came up with a way to make it appear that they were bringing forth frogs. Why could they not come up with a way to make it appear that they were bringing forth gnats? Well, I believe the problem was gnats are too small. Again, a magician, in order to perform his tricks and perform his show, the magician has to be in control of all elements. The magician, if a magician is doing things with rings, he has to be very fluent with those rings and have complete control over the rings. If a magician is doing a card trick, he has to keep control of that deck of cards so he always knows where that card is. If a magician is pulling a rabbit out of a hat, he has to be able to control the rabbit and control the hat and control the mechanism inside the hat that's allowing him to hide a rabbit and then make a rabbit appear. Well, the same thing, in order for the magicians to turn a staff into a serpent, they had to be able to control those elements, and they had to control water and blood and frogs. The problem here is gnats are very small. And I believe the problem was the magicians could not control the gnats well enough to make it appear that they could bring forth gnats. Yes, you can take a net and capture gnats, but they can just fly away. You can get gnats maybe into a container, but as soon as you open the container, the gnats fly away. And so the limitation that the magicians came across here was the gnats are very small, and they were not able to replicate what Moses and Aaron were doing because they could not control the gnats. Now that's significant when we read the next verse. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, This, the gnats, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had said. So we know that Moses and Aaron were not performing some trick or some sleight of hand. We know that God himself was actually taking a staff and actually turning it into a serpent. God took water and he turned it into blood. God created frogs out of nothing and brought them forth. God created gnats out of nothing and brought them forth. The magicians made it appear that they were doing all those things, but they could not come up with a way to make it appear that they were bringing forth gnats. And so at that point, the magicians understood that Moses and Aaron were not performing magic tricks. Instead, the magicians understood this was God who was doing this. But Pharaoh did not acknowledge it. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He did not listen as Yahweh had said. So let's review what we saw. God sent Moses to Egypt to talk to Pharaoh to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. God understood that Pharaoh would want to see some sort of proof that God exists and that God was speaking through Moses and Aaron. So God gave Moses the ability to perform some miracles in order to prove God's existence and in order to prove that God was speaking through Moses and Aaron. And so Moses and Aaron performed their miracles, and at first the magicians were able to pretend that they could do the same thing, but eventually Moses and Aaron brought forth gnats, which the magicians were not able to do, and at that point the magicians understood the truth. The magicians understood that this was God who was doing this, but we see that Pharaoh did not get it. The lesson for us is that this is an example of God proving his existence. God made an appearance on earth. He intervened in human affairs. He performed miracles. He proved his existence. He did it in front of eyewitnesses, and his actions were written down. They are recorded on historical documents that we have today, And so as we go out in our world and seek to fulfill the Great Commission, as we work with people who have doubts about the existence of God, we have historical documents that record the fact that God intervened in human affairs. He performed miracles. He proved his existence. He did these miracles in front of eyewitnesses, and they are recorded for us to read. Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. Bible Mountain exists to develop biblically literate Christians because the Bible is from God and each one of us is accountable to God for knowing and following the Bible. It is in our best interest to learn as much about the Bible as we possibly can. If you'd like to increase your biblical literacy, please join my email list so you can receive future videos via email for free. There are links on this video screen to take you to a sign-up page, or you can go to BibleMountain.com and click on follow. This is a free subscription and your email address will not be sold nor given away. Also, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like this video and share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.